in the Mishnah. We begin a new Perek where it says Tamid Nishchat. Zog the Mishnah, Tamid Nishchat b'shmoina u'mechza. On a regular day, the carbon Tamid, the Shechita is 8.5 hours into the day. The Karev b'tesho mechza. And then the Hakrava of it is an hour later, 9.5 hours in the day. In other words, the whole Aveda took 1 hour. Ba'arvei Pesachim, but on Erev Pesach, Nishchat b'sheva u'mechza. So the Shechita was an hour earlier, 7.5 hours in the day. The Karev b'shmoina u'mechza. And the Hakrava an hour later was 8.5 hours in the day. Bein b'choil, bein b'Shabbos. Whether Erev Pesach is on a weekday or on Shabbos. So what's the reason? Why Erev Pesach is a difference? As we'll see in the Gemara, because the carbon Pesach is brought after the carbon Tamid. So you have to have extra time after it to bring the carbon Pesach. Chol Erev Pesach lies be'erev Shabbos. If Erev Pesach falls out on a Friday, Nishchat b'sheish u'mechza. So then you have to shecht it 6.5 hours in the day, which is the earliest a carbon Tamid could be shechted. The Karev b'sheva u'mechza, and the Akrav is 7.5 hours in the day. Pesach acharav. The Pesach comes after the carbon Tamid. So as Rashi explains, and we'll see in the Gemara, when it's on a Friday, so you're going to have to do the tzliya, the roasting of the carbon Pesach before Shabbos. Can't roast it on Shabbos, so you have to have extra time for that. So therefore they bring it the earliest possible. They bring the carbon Tamid the earliest possible. So first the Gemara begins with the halacha of carbon Tamid b'chlal. From where do we know that the carbon Tamid is brought 8.5 hours in the day? Omer Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the Omer Kra, es hakeves echad tase b'boker, es hakeves hasheni tase bein ha'arbayim. What does bein ha'arbayim mean? Chalkeyu lebein shnei aravim. The carbon Tamid is brought between the two parts of the afternoon. In other words, it could have said just ba'erev. It would be understood that it's in the second part of the day, Rashi says. It says bein arbayim. You have to take the second set of 6 hours of the day and divide it, and you bring the carbon Tamid right bein, right in the middle. So therefore the Gemara explains, beis shoyis umechza lekan, 2.5 hours on one side, and shtei shoyis umechza lekan, 2.5 hours on the other side. So that's 5 hours, 2.5 hours here and 2.5 hours there. So you have 1 hour in between. 1 hour is the time when the carbon Tamid is brought. So that's 8.5 hours in the day. That's 2.5 hours after Chatzais, and you have an hour for the carbon, and then another 2.5 hours until Tzeisak Yechavim. Masif Rava asked on this reason. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said in our Mishnah, Ba'arvei Pesachim Nishchat b'sheva u'mechza, that on Erev Pesach you do the Shechita an hour earlier. The Karev b'shmoina u'mechza, and the Akrav is 8.5 hours in the day. Bein b'choil, bein b'Shabbos, whether Erev Pesach is on a weekday or on Shabbos. If you're going to say, like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, that the source of the fact that it has to be brought 8.5 hours in the day is from this pasuk that it says bein arbayim, so it's min ha'Torah, heichim mikadmin lei. How could you bring it an hour earlier on Erev Pesach? That is the time when it must be brought. There's no reason. You can't change it on Erev Pesach. So therefore Rava says the pshat has to be different. Mitzvah the Tamid, the mitzvah of the time of when you bring the carbon Tamid, mishi notu, slowly erev, when it's going towards the night. When does that start? Rashi says it starts already from 6.5 hours into the day, when the sun starts going towards west. And the shadow of the sun that's on a person will actually go on the east, but the sun is starting to go to the west. So that's when the mitzvah starts. That's called already bein arbayim. My time da makra bein arbayim. What does bein arbayim mean? Mi idne de maschel shimsha lemarev. When the sun starts going towards ma'ariv. So hilkach. So therefore the halach is as follows. B'shar yimais hashana, every day of the year, de'ekin nedarim u'nedavais, there is all the karbanis that people would bring. The Rachmana Amar, the Torah says, Aleho chelvei hashlomim. On it, all the fats of the shlomim. And what do we learn out from this pasuk? V'amar mar. This is the Gemara here on Amud Beis that explains, Aleho hashlim kolar karbanis kulam. That on the carbon shel shachar, after the carbon tamid shel shachar, you bring all the karbanis, but you can't bring any carbon after the tamid shel bein arbayim. So therefore, ma'achrinan lei, Tartishoi, so you bring it later, 2 hours, that is, 2 hours after 6.5 hours into the day. You bring it 8.5 hours into the day. So you'll have enough time to bring all the karbanis before the carbon tamid. The Arve Pesachim on Erev Pesach, the Ikke Pesach Acharov. Here you do have to bring the carbon Pesach after the carbon tamid. Kadmina le shah achas, so you bring it an hour earlier. Vavdina le b'sheva mechza. That's in 7.5 hours in the day. Chol Erev Pesach li is Erev Shabbos. If Erev Pesach is on a Friday, the Ikke namitz li yosai. You have to have time also to roast the carbon. The loy dachi Shabbos. Roasting the carbon is not dachi Shabbos. You can do it on Friday before. So my kamina le adine. So you bring the carbon tamid at the earliest time possible according to what the pasuk says, which is b'sheishu mechza. 6.5 hours into the day. So that explains all the times that we had in the Mishnah. Now the Gemara is going to bring up Braise with the Machlokes of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. The Pshat in the Braise is not very clear. The Gemara is going to explain what their argument is about. There's 3 different ways how to learn this Braise. Taner Rabbanan, Kesiduroi, B'choil, the way it was arranged during the week. That's the same the way it was done on Shabbos. We're talking here about the carbon tamid. The Gemara is going to explain regarding what we're talking about. Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva says, Kisiduroi be'erev Pesach. Like when it was brought on Erev Pesach. So my Kamar, what are they saying? What's the argument between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel? Amar Abaye, so Abaye's pshat is, Hachi Kamar. This is what Rabbi Shmuel said. Kisiduroi b'choil be'erev Pesach. If Erev Pesach is on a weekday, so just like the time that it was brought then, kach sidurei b'Shabbos. The same thing is also if it falls out on Shabbos. Be'erev Pesach. If Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. In other words, what's Rabbi Shmuel saying? Just like on a weekday, when Erev Pesach falls out on a weekday, when do you bring the carbon tamid? 7.5 hours in the day. Shabbos is the same thing. 7.5 hours in the day. Rabbi Akiva Omer Kisidurei be'erev Pesach shechal liyos be'erev Shabbos. Just like when Erev Pesach falls out on Friday, so when do you bring it then? 6.5 hours in the day. Kach sidurei b'Shabbos. The same thing also. If it fell out on Shabbos, you bring it 6.5 hours in the day. That's his pshat in this brayse. Now, according to this, umas nisin diktani bein b'choil bein b'Shabbos. In our Mishnah that it says that you bring it 7.5 hours in the day, whether it's on a weekday or on Shabbos, Rabbi Shmueli, our Mishnah is following Rabbi Shmuel. So now the Gemara explains what is the basis of their machlekes. B'mai kamiflegi. What are they arguing about? Again, so the argument here is regarding when it falls out on Shabbos. Do you have to bring it 6.5 hours in the day or 7.5 hours in the day? So what are they arguing about? So the Gemara is going to explain the argument is when do you arrange the lechem upon him, or when do you give out the lechem upon him, whether that took up extra time. So the Gemara say. So b'musafin kaidmin lebazichin kamiflegi. They're arguing in the order of the carbon musaf and the bazichin, which is the frankincense that was brought for the lechem upon him. They would put the bazichin, they would actually take the bazichin and be makted out on the mizbeach. Then they would give out to all the kainim the lechem upon him to eat. So the question is, what's the order here? Rabbi Shmuel's opinion is musafin kaidmin lebazichin. First comes the musaf, then comes the bazichin. So therefore, here's the order: Avad lula musafin b'sheish. Carbon musaf has to be brought at the beginning of the 6th hour. So Rashi brings a pasuk for this, that the carbon musaf cannot be brought earlier than that. It can't be brought by biker. It has to be brought later on in the day. So the earliest the carbon musaf is brought is by the beginning of the 6th hour. Bazichin b'sheva. After that has to come the bazichin, which includes being makted the bazichin, giving out the lechem upon him. So that's in the 7th hour. Va'avid leile tamid b'sheva omechze. So then the carbon tamid is going to be by the 7.5 hours into the day, meaning that according to what it says here in the Gemara, we're actually giving for the bazichin an hour and a half of time. Interesting. Rashi and places both discuss this. Why did it take so long, the bazichin? So Rashi has 2 pshatim. According to one pshat, Rashi says it really didn't take that long. But another pshat, Rashi says it took that long. And the reason is because the bazichin was a few things. That to be makted the bazichin, that to give out the lechem upon him. And there's actually a sikha where the Rebbe discusses this, and the Rebbe says in Ha'ara of a sikha that it was actually also the eating of the lechem aparim. They had to eat it then. So all the bread that had to be eaten then, so it took time. So they would only bring the carbon tamid 7.5 hours in the day. Rabbi Akiva holds, no, the order was different. Bazichin koidmin l'musafin. The bazichin could be done before already, so therefore it's not going to take up that extra hour. So bazichin b'chamesh, the bazichin will be done in the 5th hour of the day. Musafin b'sheish, the carbon musaf in the 6th hour in the day, and then v'avad leitamid b'sheish u'mechza. So you can bring the carbon tamid 6.5 hours into the day, or as early as possible. So you bring it as early as possible. This is Shabbos. There's no nedarim and nedavas that are being brought on Shabbos, so you bring it as early as possible. So this is Abayi's pshat in this machlekes here. Maskef la Rava, so Rava asks on this, Midi Rabbi Akiva kesidroi be'erev ha'pesach shechal liyes be'erev Shabbos katani, in the lashon of the Braisa. Does Rabbi Akiva say anything about Erev Pesach falling out on Erev Shabbos? Doesn't say that. Katani, does it say that? Kisidroi be'erev ha'pesach stam katani. He just says like the order that it was brought on Erev Pesach. It doesn't say anything else. Elo marove. So therefore Rava says Hachi Kamar. The machlokes of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva is something else. Kisidroi b'choil da'almeh kach sidroi b'Shabbos be'erev Pesach. The same time that, so first Rabbi Shmuel is saying the time that it was brought on a regular weekday, that's when it was brought on Shabbos. If it Erev Pesach falls on a Shabbos, Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. In other words, Rabbi Shmuel is saying on Shabbos you actually bring it later. You bring it 8.5 hours into the day. The same like on a regular day. And as Rashi explains, the Gemara here soon is going to explain. The reason is because we don't want the meat of the carbon Pesach to sit there for too long because it's going to spoil. You can't roast it until after Shabbos, right? So if you're going to allow it to sit there, it's going to be warm. There's no refrigeration. It's going to spoil until you're going to roast it after Shabbos. They roasted it Matzah Shabbos. Right. You're not allowed to roast it on Shabbos. It had to be roasted on Matzah Shabbos. So they don't want it to sit there until the time it gets roasted. That's Rabbi Shmuel.
You maybe had an hour to eat it, a half an hour to eat it, to do the whole thing.
For afterwards at night.
You have to eat it before.
For Chatzais. Yeah. So that time wide. So from Tzeis until Chatzais, there's enough time. There's enough time to eat it. Rabbi Akiva says, Kisidroi be'erev Pesach. That on Erev Pesach, that falls out on Shabbos, it was brought like every Erev Pesach, which is 7.5 hours into the day. The Mishnah that says whether in the week, whether on Shabbos, that you bring it 7.5 hours into the day, Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva, not Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. So, what's the basis of the machlokes on Shabbos, Erev Pesach, whether they waited until 8.5 hours in the day or not? They're arguing about the meat being warm and being concerned that it's going to get spoiled. Rabbi Shmuel is concerned about the meat getting spoiled. Rabbi Akiva is not concerned about the meat getting spoiled. So therefore Rabbi Akiva says you bring it 7.5 hours into the day. If Rabbi Akiva is not concerned about the spoiling of the meat, so why not bring it 6.5 hours in the day? There's no nedarim and nedavas that have to be brought on Shabbos. There's no reason to delay it. There's a reason makdim l'mitzvahs, bring it as early as possible. So the Gemara brings back the same thing we said before. Kasovar, because Rabbi Akiva holds, musafin koidmin lebazichin. The order is first the musaf, then the bazichin. So avid lu the musafin b'sheish. The musafin is brought in the beginning of the 6th hour. Bazichin b'sheva. Bazichin is the 7th, and then va'avid leila tamid b'sheva u'mechza. So the earliest the carbon tamid could be brought 7.5 hours into the day. So this was Rava's pshat. This is the second pshat here. Now the Gemara is going to bring a third pshat. Maskef lo Rabbi Barula. So Rabbi Barula asked on this, Midi kisidroi bechoil kach sidroi beShabbos be'erev Pesach divrei Rabbi Shmuel ketani. Even in the words of Rabbi Shmuel himself, did Rabbi Shmuel mention anything about erev Pesach? If you look before, what Rabbi Shmuel said is, it's the same in the week and on Shabbos. He didn't mention a word about erev Pesach. Well, he didn't say anything about Erev Pesach. He says, Kisidrei b'chayil, kach sidrei b'Shabbos. So why are you sticking in Erev Pesach? Kach sidrei b'Shabbos stomachatan. He just says sidrei b'Shabbos. He doesn't say anything about Erev Pesach. Ella Omer Rabbi Barola. So Rabbi Barola says, they're not arguing about Erev Pesach at all. Hachi katani, this is the pshat here. Kisidrei b'chayil, the time that it's brought during the week in a regular day, which is 8.5 hours in the day, the Alma. Kach sidrei b'Shabbos, the Alma. That's when it was brought on a Shabbos, also 8.5 hours in the day. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva says, Kisidrei be'erev HaPesach. Every Shabbos, it was brought 7.5 hours in the day, like an Erev Pesach, Dalma, like every Erev Pesach. Kach Sidrei b'Shabbos Dalma. That's when they brought it on every Shabbos. Now, according to this, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva, they weren't even talking about Erev Pesach B'chlal. Umas Nisan Diktani, bein b'chayil, bein b'Shabbos, Divrei HaKayli. The Mishnah goes according to everybody. It's not only according to... They weren't discussing what our Mishnah is talking about, B'chlal. So now, the Gemara explains what's the basis of their argument. B'mai kamiflagi. What are they arguing about? B'gzeiras nedarim u'nedavis kamiflagi. Are we going to make a gzeira that you don't want people to make a mistake? You don't want the kainim to make a mistake that every day it's brought 8.5 hours in the day. Shabbos is brought 7.5 hours in the day. You might end up bringing on a weekday also 7.5 hours in the day, and there won't be enough time for all the nedarim and nedavas to be brought on a regular day. Rabbi Shmuel Savar Gazrinon Shabbos Atuchayil. There is a gzeira that we are afraid to change the time. Rabbi Kiva Savar Loi Gazrinon. Rabbi Kiva says there's no gzeira, so you bring it earlier. You bring it 7.5 hours in the day. So again, the Gemara asks, Eloi Gazrinon, if there's no gzeira and we're switching the time for Shabbos, so then Nev de Bevavu Mechza. You might as well make it the earliest opportunity possible. 6.5 hours in the day. Says the Gemara, no. Kasavar, Musafin, Kaidmin, Labazichin. Going back to what we said before, the order is first Musafin, then Bazichin. So Musafin B'Sheish, the Musaf is in the 6th hour, Bazichin is B'Zayin, and then V'avid Leila Tamid B'Zayin o Mechza. The earliest opportunity for the Tamid is 7.5 hours into the day. Okay, so we had over here 3 pshatim in the machlokes of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. Abaya and Rava both explain that they're arguing about Erev Pesach, and Rabbi Bar Ula he says no, they're arguing about every Shabbos, nothing to do with Erev Pesach. Now the Gemara brings another 2 braises that will prove one way or another. Meisvei Tamid Kol Hashana Kula, the Tamid every single day of the year, Karev Kol Chasa. So it's brought according to the halacha, and what is that? Nishchat b'shmeino mechza. The shechita is 8.5 hours in the day. The karev b'testo mechza, and then the yakrova is an hour later, 9.5 hours in the day. Uberev haPesach, on Erev Pesach nishchat b'zayino mechza. It's brought an hour earlier. The karev b'cheso mechza. Chali is b'Shabbos. If Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, kachal liya is b'sheni b'Shabbos. It's the same if Erev Pesach would fall out in the middle of the weekday, on a Monday. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. So that's Rabbi Shmuel's opinion. That Erev Pesach, whether it's on Shabbos, whether it's on a weekday, it's always 7.5 hours in the day. Rabbi Kiva Imer Kisidrei be'erev Pesach. Rabbi Kiva says if it falls out on Shabbos, it's the same like an Erev Pesach, which is 6.5 hours into the day. So the Gemara says, Bishloim ela Abaye nicha. According to Abaye, the way it says the machlokes here between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva is exactly like Abaye said before. When it falls out on Shabbos, when do you bring it? Do you bring it 6.5 hours in the day or 7.5 hours in the day? It's exactly what Abaye said before. El Rava Kashya. But according to Rava, how do we learn the pshat in this brayse? According to Rava, the machlokes before was whether you bring it 8.5 hours in the day or 7.5 hours in the day. Amalach Rava, so Rava says you have to read this brayse differently. Don't read it that when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, it's like it fell out on a Monday. Rather, what it means is Kisheni b'Shabbos da Alma, which is 8.5 hours into the day. Okay, in other words, according to Abaye, Kechol b'Sheni b'Shabbos meant that you bring the Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach when it falls out on Shabbos. The same if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos. Again, if Erev Pesach falls out on a Monday, which is 7.5 hours in the day. But according to Rave, no. What he's saying is when it fell out on a Shabbos, you bring it the same like on a regular Monday, which is 8.5 hours into the day. That was Rava's opinion before. That according to Rabbi Kiva, you bring it later. How did I say the right pshat? Again, let's read this one more time. Sorry. Again, Amalach Rave, Loi Teime Kachol B'Sheni B'Shabbos. When Erev Pesach falls down on Shabbos, don't say that you bring it on 7.5 hours in the day, like if Erev Pesach fell out on a Monday. Rather, you bring it 8.5 hours into the day, like on a regular Monday. That's the pshat. Okay. Okay, we're going to do one more Braisa as a raya to this. I'm going to stop for today. Zok the Gemara, Meisvei Cholies B'Shabbos. If Erev Pesach falls out on the Shabbos, Kisidroi Kol Hashana Kula. So you bring it like every day of the year, which would be 8.5 hours in the day. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. This is what Rabbi Shmuel says. You bring it like in a regular Erev Pesach, which is 7.5 hours into the day. According to Rava, this is exactly the way he explained before the Machlaikis. Rabbi Shmuel says 8.5 hours in the day because you're worried about the meat getting spoiled. And Rabbi Kiva says 7.5 hours in the day. Elola Abaye Kashya. But according to Abaye, this is a question. This is not the way he explained it before. Amalach Abaye, so Abaye answers you. Loi Teime Kesidroi Kol Hashana. Don't read it that you bring it like every day of the year, which is 7.5 hours in the day. Ele'ema Kisidroi Kol Hashanim Kulam. Like to say that of all years, meaning when Erev Pesach all years. Erev Pesach all years is 7.5 hours in the day. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva Kisidroi Erev Pesach Shechol Yis Be'erev Shabbos, which is 6.5 hours in the day, because you have to have time to roast it. So he reads this brisa differently to fit with his opinion before. Okay.